Welcome to GoldenStarsNow. Today, we are taking a slightly different journey, one that begins not with the noise of cinema but with silence. There was a time when these men ruled the silver screen. They ran, fought, fired their weapons, and embodied the very image of action itself. Millions knew them. Their names were everywhere. But time is a curious thing because even the greatest figures can slowly fade away. Today, many of them rest in places that few people ever visit, far from the applause, far from the collective memory. And this is a journey toward those names that once meant everything. If you enjoy this trip down memory lane, please subscribe, share, and tell us your favorite stars in the comments. Steve McQueen at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California, there is a place where the silence seems heavier than anywhere else. There are no lines of visitors, no fresh flowers demanding attention. Only pale earth, a few modest headstones, and a stillness that embraces everything around it. There rests Steve McQueen. There was a time when his face embodied the very essence of action cinema. He did not need to say much. The way he moved, his steady gaze, the manner in which he occupied a space, everything conveyed control. In films such as *Bullet* and *The Great Escape*, he became the symbol of a different kind of hero, more human, more reserved, yet no less dangerous. But what many people never knew was that beneath that composed image was a man who never seemed to find true peace. Away from the cameras, McQueen lived with a constant restlessness. He loved speed, motorcycles, and racing. It was not merely about adrenaline, it was a way of filling a void that never seemed to disappear. Because even though he had everything, fame, wealth, and recognition, something always felt missing. And with time, everything began to change. By the late 1970s, his presence in Hollywood had started to fade. New actors emerged, new styles took hold, and new stories captured audiences. The film industry continued moving forward, but he was no longer at its center. Then came the news that changed everything. In 1979, he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. He sought alternative treatments, looking beyond conventional medicine and traveling in search of one more chance. But time was no longer on his side. Steve McQueen died in 1980 at just 50 years old. Today, his grave is simple, without grand tributes or monuments reflecting what he once represented. It is a quiet place where the echo of his name is rarely heard. And it is difficult not to notice the contradiction. A man who lived surrounded by movement, speed, and danger now rests in a place where nothing happens. The noise has faded. The action has ended. And all that remains is silence. From here, we leave this quiet corner behind and continue onward toward another name. Another story that time has also slowly allowed to fade away. Charles Bronson at Brownsville Cemetery in Vermont. There is a modest place surrounded by trees and quiet paths where time itself seems to move more slowly. It is not somewhere people stumble upon by chance. You have to know it is there in order to find it. There rests Charles Bronson. For many years, his face was one of the most recognizable in action cinema. He was never the typical elegant or charming hero. There was something tougher about him, something rougher. His expression, almost always serious, carried a constant sense of danger, as though everything could erupt at any moment. Films like *Death Wish* transformed him into a symbol of vengeance, direct justice, and the kind of character who never hesitated but simply acted. But what many people never realized was that his toughness was not merely a performance. Bronson grew up in a humble family as the son of immigrants, working in coal mines from a very young age. Long before Hollywood, he already understood hard labor, exhaustion, and the realities of a difficult life. Perhaps that is why, when he portrayed hardened men on screen, it never felt entirely like acting. Yet time spares no one. As the years passed, the style of filmmaking that had made him famous began to fade away. New generations emerged, new methods of storytelling took hold, and that raw, direct approach slowly disappeared. Along with it, so did his prominence. But the most difficult chapter came later. In his final years, Bronson suffered from serious health problems, including the gradual loss of his memory. The man who once seemed indestructible on screen slowly lost the very things that made him who he was. He passed away in 2003 at the age of 81. Today, his grave is understated and quiet, without grand markers or crowds of admirers. It is a peaceful place where silence weighs more heavily than memory itself. And it is strange to think that someone who embodied strength, determination, and decisive action would ultimately rest in a place so still, so distant from everything he once represented. Time moved forward. The world changed, and little by little, his name became less frequently spoken. From this quiet place, our journey continues toward another story, another face that was once impossible to ignore and that today is remembered by only a few. Kirk Douglas at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. There are clean pathways, well-kept lawns, and headstones bearing names that were once larger than life. It is a place that still receives visitors, yet even here, some stories grow quieter with the passing of time. There rests Kirk Douglas. For decades, his presence in cinema was impossible to ignore. He possessed an intense energy, almost defiant in nature. He did not merely portray strong men, he seemed to become them. In Spartacus Asterisk, for instance, he was more than a rebellious leader. He embodied a man willing to confront everything, even destiny itself. But what many people never knew was that his strength did not begin in Hollywood. Douglas was raised in a poor immigrant family. From an early age, he understood what it meant to fight for every opportunity. Perhaps that is why each of his performances carried something genuine, something that could never be manufactured or imitated. Over time, he became one of the central figures of classic cinema, respected, admired, and at times feared for his strong personality. He was not an easy man, nor did he strive to please everyone. Yet that very quality made him unique. And still, nothing lasts forever. As the decades passed, the world of film evolved. New generations arrived, and new ways of telling stories emerged. His name remained monumental, but his presence gradually became more distant. Then came one of the greatest challenges of his life. In 1996, he suffered a stroke that severely affected his ability to speak. For a man whose power was expressed not only through his actions but also through his voice, it was a devastating blow. Yet even then, he refused to surrender. Kirk Douglas passed away in 2020 at the age of 103. Today, his grave rests in a place shared with other legends. And yet, the world no longer revolves around him as it once did. His name remains, but it feels increasingly distant, like an echo slowly fading into silence. And it is impossible not to reflect on the irony. Even a man who symbolized struggle, resilience, and strength ultimately found the same stillness that awaits everyone. From here, our journey moves onward to another story, another figure that time has also gradually left behind. Burt Lancaster. At Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles, among quiet pathways and headstones that preserve the stories of classic cinema, there is a place that does not particularly stand out. There are no constant crowds or signs indicating that someone who once filled screens around the world rests there. There is only silence and time. That is where Burt Lancaster lies. There was a time when his name was synonymous with pure energy. Before becoming an actor, he had been an acrobat, and that experience shaped every movement he made on screen. He did not simply perform action scenes, he lived them. His body was part of the character, and that made him different, almost impossible to ignore. In films like Asterisk, The Crimson Pirate Asterisk, and Asterisk, From Here to Eternity Asterisk, he became one of the defining figures of a generation in which action was physical, direct, and free of artifice. He needed no special effects. He himself was the spectacle. But what many people did not know was that he never wanted to remain in that role forever. As time passed, Lancaster sought something more, deeper characters and more complex stories. He wanted to be taken seriously as an actor, not merely as a physical presence. And although he succeeded, that transformation also distanced him from the kind of films that had first made him famous. Little by little, everything began to change. The industry evolved. New faces took center stage, and names like his gradually moved into the background. He remained deeply respected, but he was no longer in the spotlight. In his later years, a stroke affected his health and limited his mobility. For someone whose identity had been so closely connected to the body and to movement, it was a quiet yet profound change. He died in 1994 at the age of 80. Today, his grave remains peaceful, not completely forgotten, but far removed from the noise that once surrounded him. It is a place where memory still exists, though it grows fainter with every passing year. And it is impossible not to reflect on the irony. A man who lived in constant motion ultimately came to rest in a place where everything stands still. The energy disappears, the body falls silent, and all that remains is a story that time continues to carry farther away, little by little. From here, we move on to another story, another figure who was once impossible to ignore and who today is only faintly remembered. Yul Brynner. At the St. Michel de Bois-Aubry Monastery Cemetery in France, far from Hollywood and far from the noise, there is a place surrounded by trees and quiet paths where time seems to move more slowly. It is not a tourist destination. There are no crowds, only silence and memory. That is where Yul Brynner rests. There was a time when his image was impossible to forget. His completely shaved head, his intense gaze, his commanding posture. Brynner did not need to say much to establish his presence. In the Magnificent Seven he embodied a quiet and dangerous leader, a man whose calm exterior concealed tremendous strength. But what many people did not know is that his iconic appearance was not merely an aesthetic choice. Brynner first shaved his head for a role, and it eventually became part of his identity. It was a way to distinguish himself, to create something unique in an industry filled with similar faces, and it worked. For years, his image was recognizable anywhere in the world. Yet nothing remains the same forever. As the years passed, the kind of films that had made him famous began to disappear. New styles emerged, and new stars took center stage. Although his presence remained powerful, he no longer occupied the same place within the industry. Then everything changed. In the 1980s, Brynner was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had been a smoker for many years, and eventually that reality caught up with him. Even so, he continued working, maintaining the quiet strength and commanding presence that had always defined him. He died in 1985 at the age of 65, today. His grave lies far from the bright lights, not in Los Angeles, nor at the heart of the industry that made him famous, but in a peaceful corner of France, a place where almost everything is silence. And it is a strange thing to consider. A man who once dominated the screens simply by appearing now rests in a place visited by very few. The face remains unforgettable, yet the place where he sleeps endures in complete calm. And from here, the journey continues toward another story, another figure who was once great and whom time has gradually left behind. 6. Robert Mitchum. At Oddfellows Cemetery in Delaware, there is a quiet place, almost hidden among trees and little-traveled paths. It is not a common destination, nor a site that appears in tourist guides. It is one of those places where silence seems to have settled permanently. That is where Robert Mitchum rests. There was a time when his screen presence was unmistakable. He never needed to raise his voice or exaggerate his gestures. His style was different, more restrained, colder, and more controlled. In his film noir and action roles, he projected a constant sense of danger, as though something threatening could happen at any moment. But what many people did not realize was that the carefree attitude he displayed was not always an act. Mitchum lived outside many of Hollywood's rules. He did not seek to fit in, nor did he try to please everyone. His approach to both acting and life was freer, even unpredictable, and that made him a unique figure, but also one that was difficult to define. For decades, he remained one of cinema's most enduring faces. Films like The Night of the Hunter left a mark that is still remembered today, although with each passing generation, that memory grows fainter, and over time, everything began to change. The style of filmmaking that had defined his career slowly disappeared. New trends emerged, new rhythms took hold, and new ways of telling stories captured audiences. Figures like Mitchum, who represented another era, gradually faded into the background. But the change was not sudden. It was slow, almost silent. In his later years, his presence diminished. Fewer roles, less exposure, and less public attention. There was no dramatic farewell, only a gradual retreat from the spotlight. He died in 1997 at the age of 79. Today, his grave is simple. There are no grand monuments and no crowds stopping to pay their respects. It is a peaceful place where memory remains, but without noise or ceremony. And it is curious to think about. A man who could convey danger with a single glance now rests in a place where nothing happens at all. The tension has vanished. The darkness of the movies has faded into the past, and all that remains is a name that time continues to carry farther away, little by little. From here, we move on to another story, another face that once dominated the screen and that today almost no one seeks out anymore. Lee Marvin. At Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, orderly rows of white headstones stretch as far as the eye can see. It is a solemn place filled with history where every name represents a life defined by far more than fame alone. Among them rests Lee Marvin. There was a time when his presence on screen was impossible to ignore. A rugged face, a deep voice, and a cold, unwavering stare. Marvin did not merely portray dangerous men, he seemed to be one of them. In films like The Dirty Dozen and Point Blank his direct, unembellished style made him one of the defining figures of action cinema in his era. But what many people did not know was that his toughness came from more than acting. Before Hollywood, Marvin served as a Marine during the Second World War. He was wounded in combat, and that experience remained with him for the rest of his life. Perhaps that is why, when he portrayed broken, violent, or exhausted men, there was something undeniably real about his performances, something that could never be imitated. For years, his name was synonymous with intensity. He was not a traditional hero. He represented something rougher, more uncomfortable, and closer to reality itself. And yet, time eventually caught up with him as well. As the industry evolved, his style began to feel like a relic of another era. New generations emerged, new rhythms took hold, and new stories captured the public imagination. Little by little, his presence on screen faded away. There was no single defining moment, only a silence that gradually grew. He died in 1987 at the age of 63. Today, his grave rests in a place defined by honor and respect, but also by profound stillness. It is not the kind of place where people remember scenes from movies. It is a place where everything comes to a halt. And it is impossible not to reflect on the contrast. A man who embodied violence, war, and raw human struggle ultimately came to rest in a space devoted to order, peace, and silence. The noise has faded. The battles are over. And all that remains is one name among many others. From here, the journey continues toward another story, another figure who was once feared and who today is only faintly remembered. Lee Van Cleef, at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills. There are carefully maintained pathways, immaculate gardens, and headstones that seem to blend into a landscape designed not to disturb the silence. It is a place where many figures of cinema rest, though not all receive the same attention. That is where Lee Van Cleef lies. There was a time when his face was impossible to forget. He was not the traditional hero. His sharp, almost threatening gaze made him the perfect villain or the kind of Western gunslinger who needed no words to command respect. In the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s, especially in collaboration with Sergio Leone, his presence became iconic. But what many people did not know was that his path to success was far from immediate. For years, Van Cleef played small, nearly invisible roles. He appeared on screen and then disappeared again. He He was not the center of attention, nor was he the leading name. And just as he was beginning to establish himself, a serious car accident nearly ended his career. His injuries were severe, and for a time it seemed that he might never act again. But he returned, and that return changed everything. In Europe, far from Hollywood, he found a second chance. There, his image fit perfectly into a new kind of cinema, grittier, more stylized, and more uncompromising. And for a brief period, he once again stood at the top. Yet that moment could not last forever. As the years passed, the genre that had made him famous began to fade. Westerns no longer dominated the screen, and with their decline, his place within the industry slowly vanished as well. And once again, there was silence. He died in 1989 at the age of 64. Today, his grave remains in a beautifully maintained setting, but without the constant echoes of those who remember what he once represented. It is not an empty place, but neither is it filled with a lasting presence. And it is a curious thing to consider. A man whose gaze could command an entire scene now rests in a place where few people stop for very long. The danger has disappeared. The duels are over, and all that remains is a figure that time has been slowly erasing. From here, we continue onward to another story, another face that was once essential and is now seldom mentioned. Glenn Ford, at Woodlawn Memorial Cemetery in Santa Monica. There is a peaceful place with open pathways and headstones that almost blend into the surrounding landscape. It is not a destination filled with constant visitors. It is one of those spaces where memory still exists, but without noise or fanfare. That is where Glenn Ford rests. There was a time when his face was among the most familiar in American cinema. He was neither the exaggerated hero nor the obvious villain. There was something different about him, a natural quality that made every character he portrayed feel approachable and real. In westerns and action films, Ford embodied the kind of man who never sought trouble but knew how to confront it when it arrived. His style was restrained, deeply human, and it was precisely that authenticity that connected him to audiences. But what many people did not know was that his journey was not defined solely by success. Although he was a major star for decades, his career experienced its share of ups and downs. He did not always remain at the center of the industry, and over time, his presence gradually lost momentum. There was no dramatic fall from grace, only a slow fading from the spotlight. And little by little, silence took its place. As new generations stepped forward, names like his moved into the background. He remained respected, but he was remembered less and less with each passing year. In his later years, his health declined. Physical and cognitive problems distanced him even further from public life. He died in 2006 at the age of 90. Today, his grave rests in peace, not completely forgotten, but far removed from the constant admiration he once enjoyed. It is a place where time seems to have softened everything, even memory itself, and it is impossible not to reflect on it. A man who spent so many years inhabiting countless stories eventually came to rest in a place where no new stories are told. Cinema moved forward. The images changed, and all that remains is a name that slowly drifts farther away from the collective memory. From here, we continue toward another story, another face that once felt familiar and that today is remembered by very few. James Coburn, at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. Among names that once defined an era of cinema, there are graves that pass unnoticed not because they lack importance, but because time changes the way we remember. That is where James Coburn rests. There was a time when his presence was synonymous with style and danger. Tall, lean, with a faint smile and a calmness that always seemed deliberate, Coburn never needed to impose himself through force. He did it through attitude. In action films and westerns, the way he moved, spoke, and looked at others made him impossible to forget. But what many people did not realize was that behind that relaxed appearance lay constant discipline. Coburn was not merely a man of natural charisma. There was hard work, preparation, and control behind every performance. Each gesture appeared effortless, yet every movement was carefully measured. And for many years, that mastery secured his place within the industry. Yet nothing remains unchanged forever. As cinema evolved, the kind of characters he embodied gradually lost their place. New forms of action emerged, new stars captured audiences, and new stories took center stage. Little by little, his presence diminished. There was no sudden ending, only a slow and quiet retreat. During the 1980s and 1990s, health problems related to rheumatoid arthritis affected his mobility. For someone whose elegance on screen depended so heavily on physical expression, it was a difficult transformation. And still, he returned. In 1999, he won an Academy Award for *Affliction*, proving that his talent remained undiminished. But that comeback did not alter the passage of time, it merely illuminated his brilliance for one final moment. He died in 2002 at the age of 74. Today, his grave rests in silence, not completely forgotten, but far removed from the constant admiration he once inspired. It is a place where the echoes of his style and presence grow fainter with each passing year, and it is impossible not to reflect on it. A man who could command an entire scene simply by being there now rests in a place where there is no stage at all. The style has faded, the presence has grown quiet, and all that remains is a memory that time continues to soften little by little. From here, we move forward to another story, another face that once had its moment and is now rarely mentioned. George Kennedy. At the Idaho State Veterans Cemetery in Boise, there is an open and peaceful place where the wind seems to move slowly through orderly rows of headstones. It is not a site associated with the glamour of Hollywood. Instead, it is a place of calm, far from the noise and far from the spotlight. That is where George Kennedy rests. There was a time when his presence was a constant in action cinema. He was not always the leading man, but he was impossible to overlook. His imposing stature, his commanding voice, and his straightforward style of acting made him the kind of performer who added weight to every scene in which he appeared. In films like *Cool Hand Luke* and the *Airport* series, he represented authority, strength, and stability. He was the man who stood firm when circumstances became difficult, the one who held everything together when it seemed ready to fall apart. But what many people did not realize was that his journey to the screen began far from the cameras. Before becoming an actor, Kennedy served in the military for several years, and that experience shaped the way he carried himself on screen. There was no exaggeration in his performances. There was something genuine, something earned through real life. For decades, he remained a solid presence in Hollywood, not the brightest star, perhaps, but certainly one of its most dependable. And yet, time continued to move forward. As stories changed and new leading figures emerged, the kind of roles that defined his career gradually lost their place. There was no dramatic downfall, only a slow disappearance. Fewer roles, less visibility, and fewer memories in the public eye. He died in 2016 at the age of 91. Today, his grave rests in a tranquil setting. It is not a place filled with constant visitors or ongoing tributes. It is a place where silence feels entirely appropriate, and it is impossible not to reflect on the irony. A man who spent years representing strength, authority, and unwavering presence ultimately came to rest in a place where there is no one left to protect. The voice has fallen silent. The imposing figure has disappeared. And all that remains is a name that time continues to leave behind, little by little. From here, we continue onward to another story, another face that once carried the weight of so many scenes and that today is remembered by very few. Ernest Borgnine. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, there are quiet corners where the passage of time seems gentler, almost invisible. Not everyone who rests there is remembered with the same intensity. Some names simply fade away, little by little. That is where Ernest Borgnine rests. There was a time when his face was unmistakable. He was not the elegant or flawless action hero audiences were accustomed to seeing. His appearance was rougher, more approachable, almost weathered. and it was precisely because of that authenticity that his characters felt so believable. In war films, westerns, and action movies, he portrayed hard men shaped by life's struggles. But what many people did not know was that this image had genuine roots. Before becoming an actor, Borgnine served in the United States Navy. He had known discipline, hardship, and perseverance long before arriving in Hollywood. And that reality could be seen in every role, every gesture, and every expression. For decades, he remained a constant presence. He was not always the leading man, but he was always someone who left a lasting impression. He even won an Academy Award for embodied, proving that his talent extended far beyond physically demanding roles. Yet time never stands still. As generations changed, the kinds of characters he embodied gradually disappeared. Cinema evolved, stories transformed, and his presence slowly diminished. There was no dramatic ending, only a quiet and gradual retreat. He died in 2012 at the age of 95. Today, his grave rests in peace. It is not completely forgotten, but it is far removed from the constant recognition he once enjoyed. It is a place where memory remains, though without the intensity it once possessed. And it is impossible not to reflect on it. A man who spent decades representing toughness, experience, and resilience ultimately came to rest in a place defined entirely by silence. The stories have ended. The voices have faded away. And all that remains is a presence that time continues to soften little by little. From here, we move forward to another story, another face that belonged to a different era and that today is rarely mentioned, **** Jack Palance. At Proctor Cemetery in Pennsylvania, there is a small place surrounded by nature, far from the noise and far from any trace of Hollywood. It is not a destination people visit out of curiosity. It is peaceful, almost invisible to the outside world. That is where Jack Palance rests. There was a time when his face was impossible to forget, sharp, weathered, and marked by an intense gaze that seemed to pierce through the screen. Palance never needed to do much. His mere presence created tension. In action films and westerns, he was the kind of figure who commanded either respect or fear. But what many people did not know was that his toughness was not simply part of a performance. Before entering the world of cinema, he served as a pilot trainee in the United States Army Air Forces during the Second World War. He had experienced events that left lasting marks, and that reality shaped the way he acted. There was no artifice in him. There was something genuine, something that could not be imitated. For years, he remained a constant presence in film, often portraying villains, hardened men, and difficult characters, yet always leaving a powerful impression. And still, time continued its course. As cinematic trends changed, the kind of commanding presence he represented gradually lost its place. There was no dramatic downfall, only a slow fading from the spotlight. But then, unexpectedly, he returned. In 1991, he won an Academy Award for City Slickers, reminding the world that his talent had never disappeared. It was a brief moment, but an important one. He died in 2006 at the age of 87. Today, his grave rests in a secluded place. There are no crowds and no constant visitors. It is a setting where silence feels entirely natural, and it is impossible not to reflect on it. A man whose gaze could dominate an entire scene now lies in a place where few people stop to look. The intensity has faded. The commanding presence is gone. And all that remains is a memory that time continues to carry farther into the distance, little by little. From here, we move on to another story, another face that was once feared and that today is remembered by very few. Rod Taylor. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, there are quiet corners where silence seems to embrace everything gently. It is not an abandoned place, yet neither is it filled with activity. It is one of those spaces where time passes unnoticed. That is where Rod Taylor rests. There was a time when his face was familiar to millions of moviegoers. He was not the exaggerated, larger-than-life hero, but he possessed a steady and confident presence that fit perfectly within adventure and action films. In movies such as **The Time Machine** and **The Birds**, he represented the kind of man who, without seeking it, found himself confronting the unexpected. But what many people did not realize was that his career always existed between two worlds. On one hand, he had everything necessary to become a major star. On the other, he never completely fit the traditional Hollywood mold. He was neither the most rebellious nor the most flamboyant figure, and perhaps for that reason, his place within the industry remained somewhat more understated. For years, he worked consistently. He appeared in important films and shared the screen with some of cinema's biggest names, yet he was rarely the unquestioned center of attention. And with time, everything gradually began to fade. The industry changed. Styles evolved, and the type of character he represented slowly slipped into the past. There was no dramatic downfall, only a quiet retreat from the spotlight. He died in 2015 at the age of 84. Today, his grave rests in peace. It is not completely forgotten, but it stands far from the attention that once surrounded him. It is a place where memory still exists, though it grows fainter with every passing year, and it is impossible not to reflect on it. A man who spent so many years inhabiting countless stories eventually came to rest in a place where no new scenes remain to be played. The lights have gone out. The stories continued without him, and all that remains is a name that time carries farther away, little by little. From here, we move on to the final story, the last name that brings this quiet journey to its conclusion. Richard Boone, at Honolulu Memorial Park in Hawaii, far from the great centers of cinema and far from the places where stories are born, there is a peaceful space surrounded by greenery and silence. It is not somewhere people arrive by chance. You have to know it is there in order to find it. That is where Richard Boone rests. There was a time when his voice and presence were unmistakable. In television and Western films, Boone embodied the kind of man who was firm, authoritative, and intensely compelling without ever needing to exaggerate. In *Have Gun, Will Travel*, he became an iconic figure, a man who commanded respect with nothing more than the sound of his voice. But what many people did not realize was that his relationship with fame was never simple. Boone was not an actor who constantly sought the center of attention. He preferred to keep his distance, choose his own projects, and move through life on his own terms. And over time, that same independence gradually carried him away from Hollywood. He made the decision to leave. He moved to Hawaii, far from the industry and far from the pace that had surrounded him for so many years. To many people, it seemed like an unusual choice. But for him, it appeared to be a necessary one. And so, the silence began earlier than anyone expected. His presence on screen diminished. His name appeared less frequently, and little by little, he faded from the public eye. He died in 1981 at the age of 63. Today, his grave rests in a secluded place, far from the traditional paths of cinematic remembrance. There are no grand tributes and no constant visitors. It is a place where everything seems to stand still, and it is impossible not to reflect on it. A man whose presence was once so commanding and so recognizable now rests in a place reached by very few. The voice has fallen silent. The figure has disappeared, and all that remains is a story that time itself has left in quiet repose. Here, the journey comes to an end. Along this path, we have encountered names that once meant everything, men who ran, fought, and endured on screen, and who for years seemed impossible to forget. But time always moves forward. Today, many of them rest in peaceful places, far from the noise and far from the constant gaze of the world. They have not vanished, but they are no longer present in the way they once were. And perhaps that is what remains in the end. Not fame, not applause, but memory growing quieter with each passing year, because even the most powerful stories eventually come to rest in silence.